The Tommy gun, the trench broom, the Chicago typewriter. Used by both hero and villain alike, the Thompson submachine gun is an icon of not just World War II, but of organized crime in the 1920s and 30s. The Thompson effectively defined the term submachine gun, and proved to be a very capable one. Despite its creation just after the First World War, it still served up until the 1970s, and finds limited use today in conflicts such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Reliable and able to withstand almost any environment, it's no wonder why it became so popular. With almost 2 million produced, it was a staple of the US military throughout the Second World War. The first widely used military version of the Thompson, the M1928, weighs in at a little under 11 pounds without a magazine, firing 45 ACP from 20, 30, 50, or 100 round magazines at distances of up to 150 meters. With a fire rate of 7 to 800 rounds per minute, moving at 285 meters per second, it was more than capable of winning a firefight, especially during World War II. The Thompson's story begins near the end of World War I, when the US Army tasked Brigadier General John Thompson, chief of the small arms section of its ordnance department, with designing a short-range, rapid-firing, large-capacity infantry trench broom. At the time, the belligerents of the war were stuck in a stalemate, both entrenching themselves across the entire front line. To win the war, a new kind of weapon would be needed. Thompson drew from an earlier patent called the Blishlock for the weapon's operation, but quickly found that only 45 ACP would be suitable for it. Soon after, the Annihilator 1 was produced in 1919, dispensing 1,500 rounds per minute, but due to not having cooling fins fitted, had to be revised. The Annihilator 2, also known as the M1919, features both semi and automatic fire capabilities, a finned barrel, removable foregrip, and a redesigned receiver to be compatible with 20-round box magazines, as well as higher capacity drum magazines. However, this did lower the fire rate to 800 rounds per minute. After Thompson contracted Colt, then known as the Colt Patent Firearms Company, the first production model was finished in 1921, designated the M1921A, and advertised as an anti-bandit gun. The US Post Office and Marine Corps placed orders for the M1921A in 1926 in order to protect mail trains after a string of violent armed robberies. However, nothing was stopping the criminals from getting their own hands on the Thompson. During the Prohibition era, organized crime was incredibly prevalent, and the gangsters' use of the Thompson brought it notoriety, especially after the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Outlaws like Bonnie and Clyde and Machine Gun Kelly gave the SMG a darker side, with it gaining the moniker, the gun that made the 20s raw. Nonetheless, it was adopted by the FBI following the Kansas City Massacre in 1933, and would be adopted by the US military in 1938 as the Model 1928, ultimately being succeeded by the M1928A by the time the US entered World War II. After a request by the military to simplify the Thompson further, the M1 was produced, and then improved upon by the M1A1, both of these weapons replacing the Blishlock with a simpler blowback mechanism, replacing the foregrip and ditching the drum magazines. During World War II, the Thompson would see action in all theaters, being fielded primarily by scouts, ranger battalions, paratroopers, and commando units, but unfortunately, due to cost and weight, the US would phase out the M1A1 for the new M3 grease gun in 1943, with Thompson production stopping a year later. You can't really keep a good thing down though, and even after production ended, the Thompson would be used in the Arab-Israeli War, the Greek Civil War, Korean War, and Vietnam War, and still cropped up in limited service roles around the world into the late 20th century. The Thompson has a number of variants, many being experimental or prototype weapons, the previously mentioned Annihilator 1 and 2 being such weapons, along with the Thompson .30 carbine. This carbine was intended to be put into service as a light rifle based on the M1921 and M1927 models, but proved too expensive to mass produce, and was succeeded by the M1 carbine. As for production models, there are several Thompson pattern weapons. The M1921, save for the military service Thompson variants, is possibly the most famous version of the weapon. Featuring an adjustable rear sight, finned barrel, and vertical foregrip, it became both famous and infamous with its use by both police and criminals alike. The M1923 was designed to replace the M1918 bar, firing a heavier .45 Remington Thompson cartridge, giving the weapon a longer effective range. Furthermore, it introduced a horizontal forearm, improved stock, and a bayonet mount, however was not given much consideration due to the military satisfaction with the bar. The next production variant of the Thompson came in 1928, designated the M1928, and was adopted by the US Navy and Marine Corps, the major difference being that it was adjusted to lower its rate of fire to satisfy the Navy's requirements. The M1928A1 would follow in the late 1930s, entering service just before the US entered World War II. It had a horizontal forend, replacing the foregrip used on earlier models, and was able to be used with a sling. And though it was able to use any of the magazine types, the drum magazines became problematic, being more prone to jamming, rattling when on the move, and were too bulky. As the war progressed, the Thompson was again updated in early 1942, this time designated as the M1, omitting the compensator, barrel cooling fins, and the Blischlock mechanism in order to simplify the SMG's operation and to make production cheaper, along with adding a reinforcing bolt to prevent damage to the stock. Later that year, the M1A1 would be introduced, the main difference being their bolts, the M1A1 utilizing one that eliminated unnecessary parts. There are also several semi-automatic variants of the Thompson, those being the M1927 series. These versions produced in the late 20th century and early 2000s for the collector's market. A storied weapon then, serving both sides of the law, along with being thrust into the largest conflict the world had ever seen. While its service in the military was short, it is undeniably one of the most famous firearms used in World War II. Its successor, the M3 grease gun, whilst being cheaper and easier to produce, never had the same charm that the Thompson did. From the streets of Chicago to the battlefields of Europe and everywhere in between, the Thompson certainly made its mark.